Thanks for joining. Today, we're just going to be discussing a really simple topic. Positive discipline is a huge topic, and there's tons of different books on it. But one of the most common questions I get is how to use the tool of consequences with younger children. So I'm going to be focusing really just on this one specific topic today. Um, Consequences. So there's two types of them. You'll hear natural versus logical consequences. Natural consequences are ones that occur without any enforcement of the parent. So if you say to your child, "Oh, you need to put your gloves on, otherwise your hands are going to get cold outside," and they go outside and they have cold hands, the parent didn't need to intervene at all. The consequence was natural. It happened, and as a parent, we don't need to do anything so that the child says to themselves, my hands are pretty cold. Maybe next time I'm going to put on some gloves. Logical consequences involve action taken by the parent. So that's you coming in and saying, I'm going to do A, B, C, D, and warning them that consequence may be happening. So how do you decide when to use a natural or a logical consequence? Um, I would say to start with natural consequences. It's nice when it occurs on its own. It's much less work for the parent, but also if it occurs naturally, then the child probably learns better and learns on their own. So it doesn't feel like the parent is saying, "I told you so." Um, Children learn more and are more likely to change when they're able to make their own mistakes. We know this about people. I think adults even more so than children. Like if someone points something out to me, I'm less likely to take it in. But if I experience it on my own, then I'm more likely to learn from my own mistake. Um, when the natural consequence of a behavior is not safe or it's life threatening, the parent must intervene and can try to use a logical consequence as an alternative. There are lots of examples, right? Like if you say to your child, "You need to hold mommy's hand when we cross the street," we're not going to wait for the natural consequence of the child crossing the street and running across and getting hit by a car. That is not safe, right? So I usually turn to my child and say, "You need to hold mommy's hand when we cross the street. Otherwise, I'm going to have to strap you into your stroller." And so the logical consequences, if that child can't listen and hold your hand, then maybe they get put into the stroller and buckled in, or you might need to carry them. Or some my kids are getting a bit older, so a lot of those consequences where I can control them don't work anymore. So it might be that okay, well then we're not allowed to walk places anymore, and mommy always has to drive. My kids would probably like that. So try not to choose a logical consequence that they would prefer. Sometimes it's just that, okay, then we need to go home. You just need to make sure with those ones that you're actually willing to follow through on it and go home in those instances where they won't listen. Um, Consequences work best when they're seen, implemented, and experienced as soon as possible. So if the natural consequence will take too long, then we want to opt for a logical consequence instead. For example, my daughter had a plant and she would get kind of lazy about watering it. And I kept saying to her, "You need to water the plant, otherwise the plant's going to die." Um, I could let that happen, and she's 5 now, so she's probably old enough to tie the 2 together, but it would take quite a bit of time for that plant to die. My son, who's 3, he would not connect the 2. He would not know that the plant died because I told him to water it every day, and he didn't. So those sorts of consequences don't make any sense because the result, the natural consequence, won't happen soon enough that the child can tie the 2 actions together. So in those cases, we want to implement logical consequences. We need to consider the context. Keep in mind that you need to consider context when trying to use consequences. Sometimes the focus needs to be on calming the child or managing a tantrum before you can even consider trying to implement a consequence. We know this with children. We can't go ahead of ourselves and start talking about the consequences we're going to implement while they're in the middle of having a mental breakdown, or their little meltdowns that they have, or their tantrums, or their high emotionality. We want the purpose of the consequence is to teach something. That's what discipline is. It's teaching. When kids are at a sort of a high state of arousal and their mood is really elevated, they're not in a place where they can learn or make logical decisions. So implementing a consequence doesn't make sense there because there's no learning happening. So we want to make sure before we try to have them choose, or before we're implementing a consequence, that there's time for them to sort of sit and calm. And then the context too has to do with where you are. So I pick and choose my moments for discipline. I don't do it 100% of the time. I get really embarrassed if we're out in public, if we're at a grocery store, or if you're in a library that's really quiet and your child is losing it. I'm not going to go through my consequences. I'm going to pick them up, throw them over my shoulder, and leave the store or leave the library or whatever setting it might be in. Whereas if I'm at a park and kids are screaming and playing and having fun, I might say to my child who's screaming really loud, you need to speak with a quiet voice, or if you can't, then we're going to have to head out and go home, because that's not kind for the other kids. So sometimes the consequence is usable in those situations. And so we want to take those learning opportunities as much as possible, but it's okay and it's understandable that there's some situations where you just need to grab and go, and it's not really a learning moment for the child or for the parent. It's so important to set the rules in advance. Consequences work best when the rules are already set. If your children know what the consequence is, for example, we have a rule in my house that we don't get TV time until the house is clean. And we also don't have snacks or meals until the house is clean. And can you tell I like a really clean house? So the consequence is that we can't move on to the next task until the first task is done and cleaned up. My kids really enjoy their screen time. They don't get a ton of it, which makes it even more valuable. So if I say to them, yep, we need to have a tidy room before we can move on to screen time, they know that the consequences is if they don't clean the room, or if they clean it too slowly, they've eaten up into all their screen time. And that's a consequence that they know happens every single time. So it's gotten to a point lately where I don't even need to, I'll just kind of say, what do we need to do before we get our screen time today? And those just go and quickly tidy up their room. Trying to create some rules in your home that involve logical consequences. So you may want to hold a family meeting that's supposed to say achieve this, not achieve this. Family meetings are great for verbal children or children that have more logic. So starting at 4 or 5 years old, they might be able to sit down with you and say, what are our family rules in the house? What do we do to maintain this household? And what are consequences for not following those rules? And you'd be surprised. Kids, in fact, my daughter often comes up with consequences that are a little bit too harsh. And she's like, you'll throw away all my toys. And I know that probably comes from me maybe accidentally saying that as a consequence, which I know I will not follow through on. But it helps me understand, I grasp more that she seems to get the concept that there are rules and there are consequences for not following those rules. I feel badly that I did not reference where this came from because I did not make this, but I believe it's in a book, a positive discipline book. If I can figure it out, I will link it underneath the recording. But this is one of my favorites. It's a logical consequences checklist. And this is similar to what you could create in a family meeting. But if you're anything like me, I think I go kind of blank, and I love having something that's pre-done. So it just says, if you break it, fix it. If you use it, put it back. If you've lost it, replace it. If you need it, ask for it. If you damage it, repair it. If you drop it, pick it up. If you make a mess, clean it. If you promise it, follow through. If it hurts, make amends. And this sort of encompasses everything. And so it's nice to be able to refer back. I love the idea. I keep meaning to do this and I haven't done it, but my kids can't even read yet. But I love the idea of having this up somewhere in the house. And what's great with even younger kids is if you can manage, if you've got the skill, having little pictures next to each one. And so that they understand, right? If your sister's building a tower and you accidentally run into the tower and you break it down, then you got to come back and help fix it. The consequences is that you need to come and repair what you've just broken. So these are some really quick ones that help me kind of figure out, hey, where do I need to go with these consequences? Coming up with consequences themselves can be quite difficult. So I encourage not doing it in the moment, but thinking about some of the most common misbehaviors your child has, and then coming up with the consequences in advance, the specific ones, right? Like these might be general rules for your home, but you may sit down with your child and talk about specific instances of like, hey, what can happen if you don't follow this rule? For example, if you make a mess, clean it up, right? Like it's saying, oh, well, what's our rule here? If you don't clean up your toys in your bedroom, what happens? Oh, I don't get my screen time next, or oh, I don't get to have snack time. I'm not encouraging starving your children, but simply skipping one snack. And they know, right? It comes to a point where they just absolutely know what's going to happen next. So how do you put it all into action? Relatability. Is the consequence related to the behavior? This is so, I wish I probably should have given this its own slide. This is so vital to consequences. They need to be tied into one another. You can't just say, what's a good example? If you don't put your rain boots on, you're not going to get TV time later. It doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? It's not about one activity that follows another. You're just trying to get your kid to put their rain boots on before they leave the house, but what does that have to do with screen time later? So we want to make sure that that they're connected, right? If you can't put your rain boots on, then we don't get to go out to the park, and that's related because that's why you're putting on your rain boots in the first place. These, like I said, like, even as I'm trying to come up with them in the moment, they are not always easy to come up with. And so coming up with it in the moment is really, really difficult. But I try to look back in the day and think, how could I have gotten my child to do that action? And what are some consequences I could have used? Because inevitably it will come up again where they'll fight me on something else. And then I have to come up with a consequence. I know my daughter is really picky about the clothes that she wears. And so we give her a certain amount of time. And the consequence is if she can't get a, a respectable, reasonable outfit together, like if she's putting on tank top and shorts in the dead of the winter, that's not going to work. So if she can get a reasonable outfit put together and on her body, then she's welcome to choose whatever she wants to wear. I often regret giving her that choice. She comes up with some wild outfits. But if she can't do it within a reasonable amount of time, and timers help with young children because they don't know what a reasonable amount of time is. So the consequence for that behavior is that I then get to dress her. I get to pick her clothes and she just has to wear them. Does that work? Not all the time, but at least I'm being consistent. So follow through. Are you actually able to follow through with the consequence you've come up with? We've all done this. I do this a lot. I think I mentioned it earlier. Sometimes I'll say, if you don't do that, I'm going to throw away your toys. Of course, I'm not going to throw away their toys. Not only is that horribly cruel, but I've spent tons of money on those toys, or what feels like tons of money. So I'm not going to just throw away all their toys. So we want to make sure that it's something you can actually follow through on versus a threat. That is a threat and it scares my children and makes them more likely to do something. The problem is if they decide to fight back, then they know that I'm not actually going to follow through with the consequence. And then they're going to apply that to they're going to generalize it, apply it to all the situations and say, mom doesn't actually do the things she says she's going to do. So I can get away with not doing what she's asking. So you always want to make sure that it's connected and that you can actually follow through with the consequence. If you say, if you scream in the store, I'm going to pick you up and we're going to leave. But then in the middle of the store, you think, nope, I really need my groceries. I'm going to let them scream all they want. All they've learned is that they can scream in the store. So it's so important to make sure you have proper consequences that you can follow through on. Timing, spoken about this already, but this is sort of our final checklist of putting it into action is, can you implement the consequence fairly soon after the behavior? They need to be able to connect that the consequences happen because of the behavior. And then this is especially important the younger the child is. And respect. I can't state this strongly enough. Are you stating the consequence in a calm, matter-of-fact way using the if then blank will happen statement? If you do this, then this will happen. I just always think that I think of if someone treated me that way or spoke to me in that way, how would I respond? And so when we're trying to use consequences, ultimately it's because we're trying to get our child to do something. And the quickest way to get me to not do something is to act rudely. You know, I don't respond well to that. I don't learn from it. In fact, it just makes me want to fight back. And so when you talk down to your child, name call, yell, all of those things make the focus about you and your mood and putting your child down versus actually teaching a lesson. Kids learn when they're calm. And so if you can say it in a really calm, matter of fact way that this is just the way it is, these are just the rules, and we got to follow them. My kids often hear me say, I didn't make the rules. And my daughters finally started to pick up that I do, in fact, make most of the rules. But I often say that I'm just like, I don't, oh no, this is just the way it has to be in here, that I didn't make the rules. This is grandma's rules, or this is the store's rules. And they're just kind of like, oh, okay, like my mom's not saying this because she's mad at me or trying to control me. It's just how it is. It's how it's got to be, and I got to follow the rules. So again, it increases compliance on your child's part. So that's my quick roundup of how consequences work and what they are. I hope it was really helpful. If you have any follow-up questions, you can call us at our admin desk at 604-436-9449, or you can shoot us an email to our admin desk at admin@camry.ca. For the Early Years Parent Support Program, you can also email us as a program directly at pspgroupsignup@camry.ca, or you can visit our website at www.camry.ca for more information and more videos. We're happy to meet with families one-on-one to go through some of this information or any other questions that they may have. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And thanks so much for joining me.